Something fundamental has changed in modern relationships, and most people feel it even if they cannot fully articulate it. The old assumptions about dating, partnership, and long term commitment no longer hold, and the gap between expectation and reality grows wider every year. What happens when one side quietly opts out, not in anger, but in exhaustion, and chooses peace instead? Stay with me to the very end of this video, because what I'm about to explain is not about bitterness. It is about pattern recognition, lived experience, and why so many men are choosing a different path altogether. If you find value in this conversation, take a moment to like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell and select all so you get every Angry Guy video the moment we release it. That small action helps the channel grow and keeps these discussions alive. I also want to remind you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, including how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly, that is exactly what the Academy is built for. So make sure you go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support for the work that goes into them, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It is a simple way to help keep the lights on and the content coming. Now, let us talk honestly, calmly, and without slogans or insults about why modern relationships are failing so many men, and why a growing number of them are not angry, not dramatic, not seeking revenge, but simply choosing to walk away. For most of human history, relationships between men and women were built around clear roles, mutual dependency, and a shared understanding of responsibility. Those arrangements were not perfect, and they were not always fair, but they were stable enough to create families, communities, and continuity across generations. Over the last several decades, that framework has been dismantled without a workable replacement. What replaced it was not balance, but confusion, contradiction, and competing narratives about what men and women owe each other, if anything at all. Men were told repeatedly that they were no longer needed in the ways they once were. They were told their traditional instincts were outdated, that their presence was optional, and that their contributions were either insufficient or suspect. At the same time, they were still expected to perform many of the same duties, absorb the same risks, and shoulder responsibility when things went wrong. That contradiction did not resolve itself. It accumulated quietly, year after year, like pressure behind a sealed door. A major shift occurred not when men argued back, but when they stopped arguing altogether. When someone is told often enough that their presence is unwelcome, that their efforts are inadequate, and that their motives are questionable, eventually they stop trying to prove otherwise. They do not storm out. They do not make speeches. They simply withdraw. They redirect their energy inward toward things they can control, toward stability, solitude, and peace. And what this is not a story about hatred, it is a story about fatigue. Many men did exactly what they were told to do. They stepped back, they gave space, they listened, they reduced their expectations. And in that process, many of them discovered something unexpected. They found that being alone did not automatically mean being lonely. They found that silence could be restorative. They found that a simple life, free from constant negotiation and emotional turbulence, had its own quiet richness. Over time, men began to notice patterns they had previously ignored or excused. They observed that modern dating often felt transactional rather than relational. That effort was expected before trust was established. That investment was demanded before reciprocity was demonstrated. That accountability flowed in one direction, while empathy was treated as optional. These were not isolated incidents, but recurring experiences shared across cultures, platforms, and age groups. Technology amplified these patterns. Social media created constant comparison, endless validation loops, and unrealistic standards on all sides. Dating apps reduced human connection to profiles and metrics, encouraging disposability rather than patience. Public conversations about relationships became adversarial, framed as competitions instead of collaborations. In that environment, many men concluded that the cost of participation outweighed the potential benefit. What is often misunderstood is that walking away was not a dramatic decision. It did not happen overnight, it happened incrementally. One bad experience followed by another, one double standard rationalized, one boundary crossed and then dismissed. Over time, the emotional math stopped adding up. The risk became clearer. The reward became less certain. The answer, for many men, was not to try harder, but to try less. When men withdrew, something else happened. They began to invest in themselves in ways they had postponed for years. They focused on physical health, mental clarity, financial stability, and personal interests. They simplified their lives. They reduced unnecessary obligations. They stopped performing for approval and started acting in alignment with their own values. What emerged was not bitterness, but calm. Minimalism became a natural extension of the shift. Men realized they did not need excess to be content. They needed comfort, autonomy, and control over their time. A quiet home, predictable expenses, hobbies that rewarded skill and focus, work that provided independence rather than constant stress. This lifestyle did not require validation from anyone else, and that independence was deeply liberating. Another critical realization was about incentives. Men noticed that many modern relationship dynamics rewarded instability rather than cooperation. Conflict generated attention. Drama produced engagement. Victimhood offered social leverage. In contrast, responsibility, restraint, and quiet reliability were often ignored or undervalued. Over time, men adapted by opting out of systems that penalized stability. This shift also intersected with legal and financial realities. Many men became acutely aware of how asymmetric risk could be in long term commitments. They studied outcomes. They listened to stories from friends, colleagues, and family members. They observed how easily years of effort could be undone by systems that did not prioritize mutual accountability. That awareness alone changed behavior, not out of fear, but out of prudence. As men pulled back, public narratives struggled to keep up. Some commentators framed the change as immaturity or avoidance. Others dismissed it as temporary or fringe. But the numbers told a different story. Declining marriage rates, lower dating participation, increased time spent alone by choice. These were not accidents, they were signals. What made this movement durable was that it did not require organization or ideology. There were no leaders issuing instructions, no manifestos, no recruitment drives. It spread through shared experience and quiet recognition. One man would hear another describe his life and think, that sounds peaceful. That sounds sustainable. That sounds like something I want. Importantly, walking away did not mean withdrawing from society altogether. Many men remained productive, engaged, and generous in their own ways. They worked, they paid taxes, they supported friends and family. What they stopped doing was overextending themselves in environments where effort was assumed and appreciation was conditional. Another layer of the shift was emotional clarity. Men realized that constant emotional labor, when unreciprocated, leads to burnout. Being expected to intuit needs, absorb stress, and remain stoic while also being endlessly accommodating created internal contradictions. Choosing solitude resolved those contradictions. It simplified emotional accounting. Over time, men also developed a sharper sense of discernment. They learned to trust patterns over promises, to prioritize behavior over words, to value consistency more than intensity. This was not cynicism, it was realism. It was an adjustment to observable reality rather than an emotional reaction. As these choices accumulated, something unexpected happened on a broader level. The absence of men in traditional dating roles became noticeable. Fewer initiations, less financial sponsorship, reduced attention. The systems that had quietly depended on male participation began to feel strain. This was not retaliation, it was consequence. Some men describe this period as rediscovering themselves. Without the constant pressure to perform or prove worth, they explored who they were when no one was watching. They found satisfaction in mastery, routine, and self respect. They stopped measuring success by external approval and started measuring it by internal coherence. This is where the phrase men walking away becomes meaningful. It is not about hostility, it is about direction, walking toward peace, toward stability, toward a life where effort produces predictable results, where boundaries are respected because they are enforced quietly, not argued endlessly. Critics often ask whether this is healthy long term. The answer depends on what one values. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. If health means constant engagement, regardless of cost, then perhaps not. But if health means alignment between values and actions, reduced stress, and a sense of control over one's life, then many men would say it is the healthiest choice they have made. What is clear is that the shift is not reversing anytime soon. Once men experience peace without chaos, autonomy without negotiation, and purpose without performance, it is difficult to persuade them to return to systems that offered less and demanded more. This is not stubbornness, it is learning. As society continues to change, these dynamics will likely become more visible. Conversations will grow louder, narratives will evolve. But beneath the noise, the underlying pattern remains. Men responded to incentives. They adapted to conditions. They chose the path that preserved their well being. This is not the end of relationships as a concept. It is the end of automatic participation without mutual respect. It is a recalibration, a pause, a reassessment. And for many men, it is a relief they did not know was possible until they experienced it themselves. When we zoom out and look at the broader picture, what we are witnessing is not a temporary cultural mood swing, but a long term behavioral adjustment. Societies change when incentives change, not when slogans change. Men did not suddenly become different creatures. The environment around them changed, and they adapted accordingly. This is how humans have always survived. When conditions become hostile or unrewarding, energy flows elsewhere. That is not rebellion, that is intelligence. For decades, men were told that compromise was the solution to every problem. Compromise your standards, compromise your boundaries, compromise your expectations. Be more flexible, be more understanding, be more patient. Meanwhile, very little was asked in return. Over time, compromise stopped being mutual and became one sided. Men were expected to adapt endlessly while the rules continued to shift beneath their feet. Eventually, many realized that the only way to regain balance was not to negotiate harder, but to disengage entirely. This disengagement was often misunderstood as fear or inadequacy. But fear looks frantic, fear looks reactive. What we see instead is calm detachment. Men are not panicking. They are not scrambling for approval. They are quietly building lives that require less permission and less explanation. That calm is precisely what makes this shift so difficult for critics to confront because there is nothing obvious to attack. No tantrums, no chaos, just absence. Absence is powerful because it reveals dependency. When men stop initiating, stop funding, stop validating, stop absorbing emotional turbulence, the imbalance becomes visible. Systems that relied on male participation without acknowledging it begin to creak. Expectations built on past behavior no longer align with present reality. That tension creates confusion, then frustration, then blame. But blame cannot manufacture participation, only incentives can. Another overlooked factor is how early this awareness now begins. Younger men are watching older men. They are seeing outcomes in real time. They are observing divorces, legal battles, financial loss, and emotional exhaustion. They are not relying on theory. They are relying on evidence. That observational learning accelerates change far faster than any ideology ever could. When a young man sees that opting out leads to peace rather than regret, the lesson embeds itself deeply. This is why appeals to tradition no longer work the way they once did. Telling men that relationships are supposed to be hard or that sacrifice is noble does not resonate when sacrifice consistently flows in one direction. Noble suffering loses its appeal when it produces predictable harm. Men are no longer willing to martyr themselves for ideals that no longer reciprocate loyalty or stability. There is also a psychological component that deserves careful attention. Constant exposure to conflict, accusation, and moral scrutiny erodes trust. When men feel they are perpetually one misstep away from social punishment, they begin to self censor, withdraw, and eventually disengage. This is not because they lack confidence, but because the cost of vulnerability becomes too high. Silence feels safer. Distance feels cleaner. In this context, solitude becomes a form of self regulation. It reduces noise, it eliminates unnecessary friction, it allows men to reset their nervous systems and reclaim mental space. Over time, many discover that their baseline happiness improves when drama is removed. That realization is difficult to undo. Once someone experiences stability after years of tension, they become protective of it. Critics often ask what happens when men grow old alone. The assumption embedded in that question is that loneliness is inevitable without romantic partnership. But many men have discovered that companionship does not require romantic entanglement. Friendships, mentorships, shared interests, and community can provide connection without the volatility that often accompanies modern dating. The idea that one path is mandatory no longer holds. Financial independence plays a crucial role in this transformation. Men who control their resources experience a level of freedom that is difficult to surrender. They can choose where to live, how to spend their time, and what risks to take. They are not negotiating these decisions under pressure. That autonomy becomes addictive, not in a reckless sense, but in a stabilizing one. It allows long term planning without fear of sudden disruption. Another important element is predictability. Many men have grown weary of environments where expectations change without warning and accountability is inconsistent. They prefer systems where effort leads to clear outcomes. Work, fitness, skill development, and personal projects all provide feedback loops that are honest and proportional. Relationships that feel unpredictable by comparison lose their appeal. This shift does not mean men have lost the capacity for care or affection. It means they have become selective about where they invest those qualities. Emotional energy is finite, time is finite, attention is finite. Men are learning to allocate these resources where they produce growth rather than depletion. That is not selfishness, that is stewardship. As this behavior becomes more common, cultural narratives will continue to struggle to explain it. Some will frame it as immaturity, others will label it avoidance. But these explanations fail because they ignore the core driver. Men are not avoiding responsibility. They are avoiding systems that punish responsibility. They are not rejecting connection. They are rejecting imbalance. One of the most telling signs of this movement is how little noise it generates. There are no marches, no demands, no ultimatums. Men are not asking for permission to leave. They are simply leaving. That quiet departure is far more impactful than any confrontation could be. It deprives dysfunctional systems of energy without feeding them drama. Over time, this creates a feedback loop. As more men disengage, the remaining participants bear greater strain. Expectations rise, frustration grows, attempts to shame or coerce participation increase. But coercion only accelerates withdrawal. Trust cannot be forced. Desire cannot be demanded. Stability cannot be legislated. What many men have realized is that peace is not the absence of people, but the absence of chaos. They are not isolating themselves from the world. They are curating their environments. They are choosing simplicity over spectacle, consistency over intensity, reality over narrative. These choices compound into a life that feels grounded rather than reactive. This is especially evident in how men now approach time. Time is no longer something to be filled with obligation at all costs. It is treated as a resource to be protected. Men are more willing to spend evenings alone, pursue solitary hobbies, or rest without guilt. Rest is no longer framed as laziness, but as maintenance. This reframing alone has profound effects on mental health. As men step away from traditional dating scripts, new forms of identity begin to emerge. Identity based on self mastery rather than external validation. Identity rooted in competence rather than approval. Identity shaped by chosen values rather than imposed expectations. This internal orientation is resilient because it does not fluctuate with social feedback. It is also worth noting that men are not uniform in this movement. Some disengage fully, others partially. Some remain open to connection under very specific conditions. What unites them is not ideology, but caution, a measured approach, a refusal to gamble blindly with their future. That caution is informed by observation, not resentment. The long term implications of this shift are significant: declining birth rates, changing household structures, increased demand for male oriented spaces that prioritize competence and mutual respect. These are not hypothetical trends, they are already visible. Societies that fail to acknowledge them risk misallocating resources and misunderstanding the needs of large segments of their population. One of the most striking outcomes is how little regret men express once they commit to this path. The anticipated loneliness often fails to materialize. Instead, men report relief, clarity, and renewed energy. This challenges deeply ingrained assumptions about fulfillment and forces a reevaluation of what constitutes a meaningful life. This does not mean that all relationships are doomed or undesirable. It means that the bar has been raised. Men are no longer willing to enter dynamics that replicate stress without offering stability. They are no longer willing to sacrifice peace for the appearance of normalcy. Normal no longer feels worth it if it is built on constant tension. As we move forward, the conversation must shift from blame to understanding. Dismissing men's choices will not reverse them. Shaming will not work. Ignoring patterns will not make them disappear. The only sustainable path forward is to examine incentives honestly and adjust expectations accordingly. Anything else is noise. Men walking away is not a slogan. It is a description of behavior, behavior driven by experience, experience distilled into choice, choice reinforced by outcome. Once that loop is established, it becomes self sustaining. What we are witnessing is a quiet rebalancing, not enforced from above, not negotiated through committees, but emerging organically as individuals optimize their lives under current conditions. That process is slow, uneven, and resistant to control, but it is real. When economics enters the picture, the shift becomes even clearer. Relationships do not exist in a vacuum. They are influenced by cost, risk, reward, and long term sustainability. As living expenses rise, housing becomes less attainable, and financial pressure increases, men naturally become more cautious about decisions that could destabilize their footing. Commitment without clarity becomes a liability rather than a virtue. The idea of building something together loses appeal when the structure itself feels unstable and the rules governing it appear inconsistent. Men are increasingly analytical about outcomes. They compare effort to return, not in a cold or transactional way, but in a practical one. When effort repeatedly produces loss, the rational response is adjustment. This is not bitterness, it is adaptation. The same instinct that guides career decisions and financial planning now guides personal choices. Men are applying risk management principles to their private lives because the consequences of miscalculation have become too severe to ignore. Another factor, often overlooked, is how responsibility has become detached from authority. Men are still expected to provide stability, protection, and solutions, yet their ability to influence outcomes has diminished. When responsibility exists without corresponding agency, stress increases and motivation declines. Over time, men choose environments where effort grants influence rather than blame. This is one reason why work, projects, and self directed goals feel more satisfying than interpersonal dynamics governed by shifting expectations. Culturally, men have been encouraged to express vulnerability while simultaneously being punished for it. This contradiction creates confusion and distrust. When emotional openness is later used as leverage or reframed as weakness, men learn quickly they do not become less emotional, they become more guarded. Guardedness is not cruelty, it is self protection refined through experience. This guardedness extends into how men communicate. They speak less about their struggles, not because they lack them, but because sharing has proven costly. Instead, they internalize, process privately, and solve quietly. This internal orientation further reduces dependence on external validation. Men begin to rely on self assessment rather than social approval. That shift alone fundamentally alters how relationships are perceived. There is also a generational acceleration at play. Younger men are not repeating the same mistakes because they have access to the stories of older men in real time. Digital communication allows experiences to be shared widely and instantly. Patterns that once took decades to recognize now emerge within years. When warnings are consistent across thousands of voices, they carry weight. This collective memory shapes behavior long before personal loss occurs. As a result, younger men are delaying or avoiding traditional milestones altogether. They are not rushing into commitments. They are prioritizing education, skills, mobility, and savings. They are choosing flexibility over permanence. This is often misinterpreted as immaturity, but it is closer to strategic patience. They are waiting for conditions that justify investment rather than assuming those conditions will materialize later. Another dimension of the shift is the changing nature of respect. Respect is no longer granted by default, it is earned through consistency and fairness. Men are less willing to tolerate environments where respect is conditional or performative. They want straightforward interactions, clear boundaries, and mutual accountability. When those elements are absent, disengagement feels like the healthiest option. The idea that men owe participation regardless of outcome is quietly dissolving. Obligation without benefit breeds resentment, and men have learned that resentment corrodes the self. Walking away preserves internal coherence. It prevents the slow erosion that comes from repeatedly compromising core values to maintain appearances. What emerges in its place is a different model of fulfillment. Fulfillment rooted in autonomy, competence, and alignment. Men pursue mastery in areas that reward effort honestly. Physical training, craftsmanship, creative work, technical skill, and entrepreneurship all offer clear feedback loops. Success and failure are visible and attributable. That transparency is refreshing compared to ambiguous social dynamics. This reorientation also affects how men view legacy. Legacy is no longer defined solely by family structure. It includes personal integrity, financial independence, and the ability to live on one's own terms. Some men still desire partnership and family, but they are no longer willing to sacrifice self respect to achieve them. The sequence has reversed: stability first, connection second. As more men adopt this approach, societal expectations lag behind reality. Institutions built on assumptions of male participation struggle to adapt. Narratives designed to motivate engagement lose effectiveness. Appeals to duty fall flat when duty has consistently been met with penalty rather than appreciation. This creates a gap between expectation and behavior that widens over time. One of the most telling reactions to this gap is disbelief. Many commentators simply refuse to accept that men are choosing differently. They assume apathy or confusion rather than deliberate decision making. This misreading delays meaningful dialogue and reinforces withdrawal. Men who feel unseen or mischaracterized see little incentive to re engage. The emotional tone of men walking away is also frequently misunderstood. It is not rage, it is resignation mixed with relief. Relief that the constant tension has ended. Relief that choices no longer require endless justification. Relief that peace is no longer conditional on someone else's approval. That relief is powerful and self reinforcing. As men settle into this quieter rhythm, their priorities stabilize. Sleep improves, stress decreases, financial habits become more disciplined, long term planning replaces short term appeasement. These practical benefits reinforce the choice to disengage from high conflict dynamics. It becomes evident that peace is not passive, it is actively constructed through boundaries and restraint. There is also a moral component that deserves attention. Men walking away are often accused of abandoning responsibility, yet responsibility toward oneself is rarely acknowledged. Self stewardship is framed as selfishness when it conflicts with external demands. Men are rejecting that framing. They recognize that neglecting oneself in the name of obligation leads to burnout and bitterness, neither of which benefits society. This does not mean men have become indifferent to others. Many channel their energy into mentorship, volunteering, or creative contribution. They simply do so on their own terms, without entanglement in dynamics that undermine their well being. Contribution without exploitation feels sustainable. Contribution with constant emotional cost does not. As this movement matures, it becomes less visible precisely because it is successful. Men who are content do not broadcast their contentment. They live quietly. They do not seek validation for opting out. They simply proceed with their lives. This invisibility can be mistaken for absence, but it is presence redirected. Another consequence of the shift is a recalibration of attraction itself. Men are no longer drawn to intensity alone. They value calm, predictability, and emotional steadiness. Chaos is no longer romanticized, it is recognized as a warning sign. This changes how men evaluate potential connections and raises the threshold for engagement. The language men use internally also evolves. They stop framing choices as sacrifices and start framing them as alignments. They are not giving something up, they are choosing something else. That linguistic shift reflects deeper psychological clarity. When choices feel aligned, resentment fades. Over time, men walking away develop a strong sense of internal authority. They trust their judgment because it is informed by experience rather than external pressure. This self trust makes them less susceptible to manipulation or guilt based persuasion. Once internal authority is established, it is rarely surrendered. The broader cultural impact of this is still unfolding. Systems adapt slowly, narratives resist change, but behavior speaks louder than rhetoric. When participation declines, the reasons eventually demand examination. Ignoring the pattern does not reverse it. Only addressing underlying incentives can. When we begin to examine the social consequences of this shift, the picture becomes more complex and more revealing. Societies function on participation. They rely on people opting in to shared expectations, roles, and responsibilities. When a significant portion of the population quietly opts out of one of the most foundational social structures, the effects ripple outward in ways that are difficult to predict but impossible to ignore. This is not about assigning blame, it is about acknowledging cause and effect. One immediate consequence is a growing mismatch between expectations and reality. Cultural narratives continue to assume that men will pursue, provide, initiate, and stabilize. These assumptions are deeply embedded in media, policy, and everyday conversation. Yet behavior is drifting further away from those assumptions each year. When narratives remain static while behavior evolves, tension builds, confusion replaces clarity, frustration replaces understanding. Institutions are often the last to adapt because they are built on historical patterns. They respond slowly to changes in behavior, especially when those changes challenge long standing assumptions. Many systems still operate as though male participation is guaranteed, even as evidence suggests otherwise. When participation declines, those systems do not immediately ask why. They first attempt to restore the old equilibrium through messaging, pressure, or moral framing. When that fails, they struggle. This struggle is visible in public discourse. Conversations become louder, more polarized, and less grounded in lived experience. Simplistic explanations are offered in place of nuanced analysis. Men are told they are confused, afraid, or broken. But those explanations fail to account for the consistency and calm with which many men have made their choices. People acting in confusion do not exhibit long term behavioral stability. People acting in alignment do. Another effect is the reconfiguration of male social bonds. As romantic partnership becomes less central, friendships and peer networks take on greater importance. Men invest more deeply in relationships that are reciprocal and low drama. Shared projects, shared goals, and shared values become the foundation of connection. These bonds are often quieter but more resilient because they are not built on expectation alone. There is also a subtle shift in how men relate to work. Without the pressure to meet external milestones tied to traditional family structures, men begin to reassess what work means to them. Some pursue higher income with greater focus. Others choose flexibility over status. Some downshift intentionally to reduce stress. Work becomes a tool rather than an identity. That recalibration changes how men interact with employers, markets, and career ladders. This shift has implications for consumption as well. Men living simpler lives consume differently. They prioritize durability over novelty, function over display. They spend less on performative purchases and more on things that enhance comfort, health, and autonomy. This affects markets quietly but steadily. Industries built on aspirational pressure may find demand softening as priorities change. Another important consequence is how men approach risk. Men walking away are not risk averse by nature, they are selective. They differentiate between productive risk and asymmetric risk. Productive risk offers growth with manageable downside. Asymmetric risk offers little upside with severe potential loss. Many modern relationship dynamics fall into the latter category from their perspective. Avoiding those dynamics is not cowardice, it is calculation. This calculation is reinforced by legal and financial frameworks that feel opaque or unpredictable. When outcomes appear disconnected from behavior, trust erodes. Men respond by minimizing exposure. This is not ideological, It is behavioral economics applied to personal life. People avoid systems where the rules are unclear or unevenly enforced. As men disengage, there is a tendency to frame the situation as a crisis that must be solved quickly. But quick solutions rarely address structural issues. Sustainable change requires honest assessment of incentives, accountability, and reciprocity. Without those elements, attempts to restore participation will continue to fail, regardless of how urgent the messaging becomes. One of the most misunderstood aspects of this movement is its emotional neutrality. Men walking away are often described as angry or resentful, yet many report the opposite. They describe a sense of calm, relief, and emotional quiet. That calm is not performative, it is lived. It comes from removing oneself from environments that consistently produce stress and replacing them with environments that offer predictability. This emotional neutrality is difficult for observers to process because it defies expectations. Anger can be confronted, resentment can be debated. Calm detachment offers no leverage. It does not argue, it does not plead, it simply persists. That persistence is what gives the movement its staying power. Another layer worth examining is how this shift affects personal identity formation. For generations, masculinity was often defined through external roles and responsibilities: provider, partner, protector. As those roles become less central, men are forced to redefine themselves from the inside out. This process can be uncomfortable, but it is also liberating. Identity becomes self authored rather than socially assigned. Self authored identity is inherently more stable because it is less vulnerable to external disruption. When identity is tied to internal standards, it cannot be revoked by social disapproval. Men who complete this transition become less reactive and more grounded. They are not seeking permission to exist as they are, they are simply living. This internal grounding also affects how men engage with conflict. They become less interested in winning arguments or proving points. Conflict loses its appeal when peace becomes the priority. Walking away from arguments becomes as natural as walking away from relationships that no longer serve them. Energy is conserved rather than expended. Over time, this creates a noticeable contrast between those who have disengaged and those still caught in high conflict cycles. The difference is not in intelligence or capability, but in emotional regulation and boundary enforcement. Men who have stepped back often appear more composed, not because life is easier, but because it is simpler. This simplicity extends to expectations. Men walking away expect less from others and demand more from themselves. They focus on what they can control rather than what they cannot. This locus of control reduces frustration and increases satisfaction. It is a fundamental psychological shift that changes how challenges are perceived. As this way of living becomes more common, it may eventually reshape cultural norms. Norms change when enough people behave differently for long enough. What once seemed unconventional becomes unremarkable. Quiet autonomy may replace performative participation as a marker of maturity. But this process takes time, and resistance is inevitable. Resistance often takes the form of moralizing. Men are told they are abandoning something essential or shirking responsibility. But moralizing without addressing underlying conditions is ineffective. Responsibility must be paired with agency. Commitment must be paired with trust. Sacrifice must be paired with appreciation. Without these pairings, moral appeals ring hollow. It is also important to recognize that men walking away are not a monolith. Their reasons vary, their outcomes vary. Some may return to relationships under different conditions, others may not. The common thread is choice: informed, deliberate choice based on observation rather than assumption. And the future will likely bring increased dialogue around these issues, but dialogue alone is insufficient. Behavior changes first, narratives follow later. We are currently in the gap between those two phases. That gap is uncomfortable because it exposes outdated assumptions without yet offering a fully articulated replacement. What replaces old models will depend on whether mutual accountability and respect can be restored, not demanded, not enforced, restored through consistent behavior and aligned incentives. Without that restoration, disengagement remains the rational default. As we move deeper into this conversation, the question becomes less about individual decisions and more about collective adaptation. Can systems evolve to reflect current realities, or will they continue to chase behaviors that no longer exist? The answer to that question will shape social stability in the decades ahead. For now, one truth remains clear: men did not disappear, they recalibrated. They redirected their energy toward lives that offer peace, clarity, and self respect. That recalibration continues quietly, largely unnoticed by those still focused on noise rather than patterns. At some point, every large social shift reaches a moment where denial becomes impossible. The signals become too frequent, too consistent, and too widespread to dismiss as coincidence. What we are seeing now is not a rebellion driven by ideology, nor a temporary retreat caused by fear. It is a recalibration driven by experience. Men are not asking what they are supposed to do anymore. They are asking what actually works, and then they are acting accordingly. One of the most important distinctions to make is between rejection and withdrawal. Rejection is emotional, withdrawal is strategic. Rejection seeks validation through opposition. Withdrawal seeks peace through disengagement. The behavior we are observing aligns overwhelmingly with the latter. Men are not staging protest. They are not demanding concessions. They are not trying to force outcomes. They are quietly redesigning their lives around conditions that feel sustainable. This distinction matters because it explains why so many attempts to reverse the trend have failed. Messaging that assumes anger misses the mark. Messaging that assumes confusion misses the mark. Messaging that assumes entitlement misses the mark. Men who have withdrawn are not waiting to be persuaded. They are already living the outcome of their decision, and that outcome feels better than what came before. There is also a misconception that disengagement equals isolation. In practice, many men report the opposite. Their social circles may be smaller, but they are more intentional. Their interactions are fewer, but more grounded. They choose environments where expectations are explicit and reciprocity is normal. This creates a sense of belonging that does not rely on constant emotional negotiation. Another overlooked factor is how men process time differently once they step away from high conflict dynamics. Time slows down. Days feel more predictable. Evenings feel less charged. This temporal stability reduces anxiety and increases focus. Men become more present in their own lives because they are no longer bracing for disruption. That presence improves decision making across every domain. This change in time perception also alters ambition. Ambition becomes less about status and more about durability. Men pursue goals that enhance long term independence rather than short term validation. They invest in skills that compound quietly rather than achievements that require constant recognition. This shift produces lives that may look unremarkable from the outside, but feel deeply satisfying from within. Critics sometimes argue that this path is selfish or antisocial, but that framing assumes that social participation must take a specific form to be legitimate. In reality, societies are healthiest when participation is voluntary and aligned with individual well being. Forced participation breeds resentment. Voluntary participation produces contribution. Men are not opting out of society, they are opting out of specific dynamics within it. There is also an emotional honesty emerging that deserves recognition. Men are acknowledging limits without shame. They are admitting that certain environments drain them rather than enrich them. This self awareness is not weakness, it is maturity. Knowing when to step back is as important as knowing when to engage. As this maturity spreads, it challenges long held narratives about masculinity. Masculinity defined by endless endurance gives way to masculinity defined by discernment. Strength becomes the ability to choose wisely rather than the ability to tolerate endlessly. That redefinition is subtle but profound. This evolution also changes how men view compromise. Compromise is no longer automatic, it is conditional. Men ask whether compromise leads to mutual benefit or unilateral depletion. When compromise serves both parties, it remains valuable. When it consistently disadvantages one side, it loses legitimacy. This selective approach preserves goodwill rather than eroding it. From a systems perspective, the most destabilizing element of this shift is its quiet nature. Systems are designed to respond to disruption that is loud and visible. Protests trigger responses. Demands invite negotiation. Silence, however, provides no clear lever. When participation simply fades, systems struggle to diagnose the problem. They may misattribute causes or propose solutions that address symptoms rather than incentives. This misdiagnosis often leads to escalation in tone rather than improvement in structure. Language becomes more moralistic. Expectations become more rigid, but rigidity accelerates disengagement. Flexibility restores trust. The path forward requires humility and a willingness to reassess assumptions that were once taken for granted. Another important aspect of this shift is how men now approach responsibility. Responsibility is no longer accepted by default, it is evaluated. Men ask whether responsibility is paired with authority, respect, and fairness. When it is, they often step up willingly. When it is not, they decline without drama. This conditional acceptance of responsibility is rational and self preserving. This rationality extends to emotional responsibility as well. Men are less willing to absorb emotional volatility that they did not create and cannot resolve. They recognize that being constantly responsible for another adult's emotional state is unsustainable. This recognition leads to firmer boundaries and, in many cases, disengagement from relationships that lack emotional reciprocity. As boundaries strengthen, men become more comfortable with being misunderstood. They no longer feel compelled to explain themselves endlessly. They accept that not everyone will agree with their choices, and that agreement is not required for legitimacy. This emotional independence further reduces susceptibility to guilt or pressure. Over time, men who walk away often experience a surprising outcome. Their sense of self stabilizes. They are less reactive to praise or criticism. Their mood fluctuates less. This emotional regulation improves health, focus, and resilience. It also reinforces the choice to maintain distance from high conflict environments. This does not mean men become closed off to connection. It means they become selective. Connection is valued when it is calm, respectful, and mutually supportive. Intensity alone is no longer attractive. Reliability becomes the new currency. The broader social implication of this shift is a gradual redefinition of partnership itself. Partnership cannot rely on assumption. It must rely on alignment. It must be chosen repeatedly, not inherited by default. This raises the standard for everyone involved. While challenging, it also creates the possibility for healthier dynamics where they do occur. However, raising standards also reduces participation. Not everyone is willing or able to meet those standards. This is where tension arises. Declining participation is framed as a problem to be solved rather than a signal to be understood. Yet understanding is the only path to adaptation. As we look ahead, it is possible that new forms of relationship will emerge that reflect these changing priorities. These forms may be less rigid, less performative, and more pragmatic. They may prioritize autonomy alongside connection rather than demanding the surrender of one for the other. Whether such forms become widespread depends on whether incentives realign. If incentives do not realign, disengagement will continue, not out of spite, but out of logic. People move toward environments where effort is rewarded fairly and away from environments where it is not. This principle applies universally, regardless of gender or ideology. One of the most telling indicators of permanence is how little nostalgia men express for the dynamics they left behind. Nostalgia often accompanies loss. Its absence suggests relief. Men are not longing for what was, they are protecting what is. This protection extends to mental space. Men are increasingly conscious of cognitive load. They avoid unnecessary arguments, performative outrage, and constant negotiation. They curate information intake. They limit exposure to environments that provoke anxiety without offering solutions. This mental hygiene supports long term well being. As mental clarity improves, men become more deliberate in all areas of life. Decisions are slower, but more confident. Impulsivity decreases. Planning horizons extend. These changes compound over time, producing lives that feel coherent rather than reactive. At a cultural level, this coherence challenges the assumption that fulfillment must be externally validated. Men walking away demonstrate that fulfillment can be internally constructed. This challenges consumer driven narratives that rely on dissatisfaction to function. Contentment is disruptive to systems built on perpetual desire. This may be one reason why the movement is often mischaracterized. Contentment does not generate engagement. Calm does not drive clicks. Quiet stability does not fuel outrage. As a result, the lived reality of many men remains invisible in mainstream narratives. But invisibility does not equal insignificance. Quiet patterns reshape societies just as powerfully as loud ones. They simply do so without spectacle. As we move toward the conclusion of this long form discussion, the central insight remains consistent. Men adjusted their behavior in response to incentives, outcomes, and lived experience. They did so quietly, deliberately, and without hostility. That adjustment is ongoing. The question facing society is not how to force men back into old roles. The question is whether new frameworks can emerge that respect autonomy, fairness, and mutual benefit. Without those elements, participation cannot be assumed. As the shift continues to unfold, one of the most revealing developments is how little external validation men now require to feel settled in their choices. In the past, social approval played a significant role in shaping behavior. Milestones were celebrated publicly, and deviation from expected paths invited scrutiny. Today, many men no longer orient their lives around applause or recognition. Satisfaction is measured privately through stability, health, and the absence of unnecessary stress. This internal metric makes the decision to disengage remarkably resilient to criticism. Resilience is the key word here. Choices rooted in anger tend to burn out quickly. Choices rooted in fear tend to reverse once reassurance appears. But choices rooted in peace tend to endure. Men who have reorganized their lives around peace are not waiting for permission to return to chaos. They are not counting the days until circumstances change. They are adapting their expectations to reality rather than insisting reality conform to expectations. One of the most consistent patterns reported by men who have stepped back is a sense of regained agency. Agency is the feeling that one's actions meaningfully influence outcomes. When agency is present, motivation increases. When agency is absent, effort feels pointless. Many men describe past relationship dynamics as environments where agency was limited, outcomes were unpredictable, and effort did not reliably produce stability. Leaving those environments restores a sense of cause and effect that is psychologically grounding. This restoration of agency often leads men to rediscover curiosity. Without the constant pressure of interpersonal negotiation, mental space opens up. Men explore interests they postponed, skills they neglected, and questions they never had time to ask. Curiosity thrives in calm environments. It withers under chronic stress. This renewed curiosity contributes to personal growth that feels organic rather than forced. Growth, in this context, is not framed as self improvement for approval. It is self maintenance for longevity. Men prioritize habits that support long term health, both physical and mental. Exercise becomes routine rather than aspirational. Nutrition becomes practical rather than performative. Sleep becomes protected rather than sacrificed. These mundane choices compound into well being that reinforces disengagement from draining dynamics. As men stabilize internally, their tolerance for dysfunction decreases further. What once seemed normal begins to feel unnecessary. Arguments that once felt inevitable now feel optional. Emotional volatility that once felt exciting now feels exhausting. This recalibration does not require moral judgment. It simply reflects a change in baseline expectation. This change in baseline also alters how men interpret language. Words that once carried emotional charge lose their power. Accusations feel less personal. Labels feel less defining. Men no longer internalize narratives that conflict with their lived experience. They trust what they observe over what they are told. This epistemic shift makes persuasion based on rhetoric increasingly ineffective. The reliance on observation over narrative is particularly important. Men are not disengaging because of what they read or hear. They are disengaging because of what they experience repeatedly. When experience contradicts messaging consistently, messaging loses credibility. Rebuilding credibility requires changes in behavior, not changes in tone. Another important dimension is how men now approach fairness. Fairness is no longer assumed as a default feature of relationships, it is evaluated continuously. Men pay attention to how decisions are made, how conflicts are resolved, and how accountability is distributed. When fairness appears asymmetric, disengagement becomes a rational response rather than an emotional one. This attention to fairness also extends to emotional labor. Men increasingly recognize when they are expected to carry disproportionate emotional weight. They notice when empathy flows in one direction and obligation flows in the other. This awareness leads to firmer boundaries and, in many cases, withdrawal from situations where balance seems unattainable. Withdrawal, in turn, creates space for reflection. Reflection allows patterns to become visible. Men connect dots across time rather than focusing on isolated incidents. They recognize recurring dynamics that previously felt coincidental. This pattern recognition solidifies the decision to disengage because it reframes past experiences as systemic rather than personal failures. Once experiences are understood systemically, self blame diminishes. Men stop asking what they did wrong and start asking whether the environment itself was conducive to mutual well being. This shift reduces shame and increases self respect. Self respect becomes a non negotiable foundation rather than an optional trait. Self respect also changes how men respond to pressure. Guilt based persuasion loses effectiveness. Appeals to obligation without reciprocity fall flat. Men no longer feel compelled to justify their choices to those who do not share the consequences. This emotional independence further stabilizes their disengagement. Over time, disengagement becomes less of an am active choice and more of a default state. Men do not wake up thinking about what they are avoiding, they simply live. The absence of turmoil becomes normal. This normalization makes reentry into high conflict dynamics increasingly unattractive. As this becomes more widespread, the social meaning of solitude begins to shift. Solitude is no longer universally interpreted as failure or isolation. It is increasingly recognized as a legitimate lifestyle choice. This reframing reduces stigma and makes disengagement easier for others to consider. The reduction of stigma is crucial because social pressure historically played a significant role in maintaining participation. When stigma fades, participation must be justified on its own merits. If those merits are lacking, disengagement accelerates. This dynamic explains why attempts to shame men back into old roles often backfire. Another consequence of the shift is the decoupling of masculinity from sacrifice narratives. Sacrifice is no longer glorified when it leads to predictable harm. Men are redefining strength as sustainability rather than endurance. This redefinition influences how younger men conceptualize their futures. Younger men, observing this pattern, are not inheriting cynicism, they are inheriting caution. They are learning to evaluate before investing. They are learning that saying no can be an act of wisdom rather than fear. This generational transmission ensures that the shift is not temporary. The implications for long term social planning are significant. Policies, institutions, and cultural narratives built on assumptions of automatic male participation may face increasing friction. Adjustments will be necessary, but adjustment requires acknowledgement. Denial delays adaptation and increases instability. One of the most challenging aspects of this transition is the absence of a clear endpoint. There is no finish line where disengagement resolves into a new equilibrium overnight. Instead, the process unfolds gradually as individuals make choices independently. This decentralized nature makes the shift difficult to manage or reverse through top down interventions. Decentralization also makes the movement resistant to co-option. There is no single message to reframe or leader to negotiate with. Men are not following instructions, they are responding to conditions. Changing outcomes requires changing conditions. As conditions stand, many men see little incentive to re engage in traditional relationship structures. The costs feel clear, the benefits feel uncertain. Until that equation changes, disengagement remains logical. This logic does not preclude hope, it simply grounds hope in realism. Hope is not the expectation that others will change spontaneously. Hope is the willingness to engage when evidence supports trust. Men have not abandoned hope. They have postponed investment until conditions improve. Understanding this distinction is critical. Postponement is not rejection, it is caution. Caution informed by experience rather than fear. When trust is rebuilt through consistent behavior, engagement may resume selectively. However, trust once broken requires more than words to restore. It requires time, consistency, and demonstrated accountability. Men who have reorganized their lives around peace will not gamble that peace lightly. Any invitation back into partnership must compete with the stability they have already built. This competition sets a high bar, but not an unreasonable one. It asks for clarity instead of ambiguity, reciprocity instead of entitlement, respect instead of assumption. These are not extreme demands, they are foundational principles. As the conversation continues, it is important to resist oversimplification. Men walking away are not villains or heroes. They are individuals responding to their environment. Their choices reflect incentives, outcomes, and personal thresholds. Reducing this complexity to slogans obscures understanding. In the broader arc of social change, such shifts often precede adaptation. Behavior changes first, language follows. Institutions adapt last. We are currently in the early to middle phase of this process. The discomfort many feel stems from this lag. Recognizing the lag allows for patience. Patience allows for thoughtful reform rather than reactive measures. Whether reform occurs depends on whether stakeholders are willing to examine assumptions honestly and adjust accordingly. For now, the pattern remains consistent. Men are prioritizing peace, autonomy, and self respect. They are disengaging from dynamics that undermine those priorities. They are doing so quietly, deliberately, and without hostility. As we bring this discussion to its conclusion, it becomes necessary to move away from abstraction and speak plainly about where this trajectory leads if nothing changes. Societies cannot indefinitely operate on assumptions that no longer match behavior. When participation becomes optional rather than automatic, every system built on expectation must either adapt or fracture. This is not a threat, it is an observation grounded in history. Social stability depends on alignment between incentives and outcomes. When that alignment disappears, people adjust independently and collective consequences follow. What many fail to grasp is that men walking away is not a demand for dominance or a rejection of cooperation. It is a refusal to operate inside frameworks that consistently generate loss without recognition. Men are not asking to be centered. They are asking not to be penalized for participation. When participation reliably produces stress, risk, and instability, opting out becomes the rational alternative. No amount of moral framing can override lived experience. The possibility of reconciliation depends entirely on whether conditions change in observable ways, not rhetorically, not symbolically, but practically. Trust is rebuilt through consistency, not declarations. Reciprocity is demonstrated through behavior, not expectation. Respect is earned through fairness, not entitlement. If these elements were to reemerge organically, some men would likely reengage, not because they are pressured, but because engagement would once again make sense. However, it is equally important to acknowledge that many men will not return regardless of change, not because they are closed off, but because they have already constructed lives that meet their needs. Once peace becomes the baseline, disruption must justify itself. The bar for reentry is high because the cost of reentry is clear. Men are not afraid of commitment, they are wary of imbalance. This wariness is not pathological, it is learned through repetition, learned through observation, learned through consequence. Men adjusted not because they wanted to disengage, but because disengagement worked. It improved health, it improved clarity, it improved focus, it reduced stress. These outcomes reinforce behavior far more effectively than ideology ever could. One of the most profound aspects of the shift is how quietly it unfolded. No single moment triggered it, no announcement marked its arrival. It spread through conversations, through shared stories, through recognition. One man would describe his life, and another would see himself reflected. That recognition carried more weight than any argument. As this recognition spreads, it changes expectations, even for those still engaged. Men who remain open to relationships do so with firmer boundaries and clearer standards. They are less willing to tolerate ambiguity. They are less willing to accept narratives that contradict behavior. This does not make relationships impossible. It makes them conditional on mutual alignment. The future, then, is not defined by collapse or conflict. It is defined by sorting. People will increasingly sort themselves into arrangements that reflect their priorities. Some will choose partnership, some will choose solitude, some will alternate over time. What disappears is the assumption that one path fits all or that deviation requires explanation. This sorting has implications beyond personal life. It affects economics, housing, labor, and demographics. When men prioritize autonomy and flexibility, they make different choices about where and how they live. They become less tethered to specific structures. This mobility challenges systems built on permanence and predictability. It also changes how men think about legacy. Legacy becomes less about lineage and more about integrity. Less about inheritance and more about independence. Men focus on leaving behind stability rather than obligation. This reframing does not diminish meaning, it relocates it. Critically, this movement is not anti connection, it is pro coherence. Men are not rejecting intimacy, they are rejecting incoherence. They are rejecting environments where words and actions diverge, where responsibility and authority are misaligned, where effort and outcome disconnect. Coherence is the new requirement. This requirement applies universally. Any system that fails to offer coherence will see participation decline. This is not unique to relationships. It is a broader pattern observable in workplaces, institutions, and communities. People invest where trust exists. They withdraw where it does not. Understanding this removes much of the moral heat from the conversation. Men walking away are not making a statement, they are making a calculation informed by evidence. That evidence may be uncomfortable to confront, but ignoring it does not change its effect. The challenge ahead is not to convince men that they are wrong, but to ask whether the conditions that produce disengagement are worth preserving. If they are not, change must be structural, not cosmetic. Structural change is slow. It requires humility. It requires listening without preemptive dismissal. If that change never comes, the outcome is not sudden collapse, but gradual divergence. Lives lived separately, expectations adjusted downward, systems recalibrated reluctantly. This is not dramatic, it is incremental. And because it is incremental, it is often underestimated. Yet incremental change reshapes societies more reliably than sudden upheaval. It embeds itself quietly. It becomes normal before it becomes visible. By the time it is acknowledged, reversal is difficult because alternatives have already stabilized. Men walking away have stabilized. They have found routines that work. They have learned to live with less noise. They have discovered that peace is not boring, it is productive, it allows for focus, creativity, and long term planning. That discovery cannot be undone with slogans. As we end this discussion, it is important to return to where we began. This is not a story of anger, it is a story of adaptation. Men adapted to conditions as they experienced them. They chose peace over performance, clarity over chaos, autonomy over obligation. They did so quietly, deliberately, and without hostility. Whether society adapts in response remains to be seen. But adaptation always begins with understanding. And understanding begins with acknowledging reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Before you go, I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the patterns described here? Have you observed similar shifts in your own life or among people you know? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because this conversation matters and your perspective adds to it. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.